I knew the moment I saw the unfamiliar truck in my driveway that something was wrong, not the kind of wrong you can shake off. The kind that settles into your chest and stays there. It was a Wednesday in late October. I'd driven 4 hours from Portland to reach my beach house in Cannon Beach. The same house I'd spent 31 years paying off. The same house where my wife Carol had taken her last good breath of salt air before the cancer took her. I hadn't been back since August. I needed the quiet. I needed the water. What I did not need was what I found when I turned that corner onto Pacific View Lane. There were 2 cars I didn't recognize parked in front of my house. A silver pickup truck with a Wisconsin plate and a blue minivan with a bumper sticker I couldn't read from the road. Lights were on inside. Every single light, the porch light, the kitchen window, the upstairs bedroom where Carol and I used to sleep with the window cracked so we could hear the ocean. I sat in my car for a moment. Just sat there with the engine running, watching the shadows move behind the curtains. My son Joel had a spare key. He'd had one since I gave it to him 3 years ago, right after Carol passed, when I thought, foolishly, I know that now, that it would make him feel more connected to the place she loved. He'd only used it twice that I knew of, once to check the pipes after a storm warning, and once to bring some friends up for a long weekend the summer before last. He'd asked me that time. Called me 2 weeks in advance, asked politely, said thank you when it was over. I was 64 years old that October. I'd spent 40 years as a civil engineer, raised 2 kids mostly on my own after Carol's health started failing, built a retirement that was modest but mine. I wasn't a wealthy man. I wasn't a pushover either. Or so I thought. I got out of the car. The air smelled like brine and wood smoke. Someone had made a fire. I walked up the porch steps and I could hear voices inside. Laughter. The kind that carries across a room when people feel completely at home. I put my key in the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. There were 8 people in my living room. 8. I counted them without meaning to. 2 children running in socks across the hardwood floor. My floor, the floor I'd refinished by hand in 2019. A heavy-set man I'd never seen before stretched out in my recliner with a beer, watching a football game on my television. A woman about my age sitting at my kitchen table with reading glasses on, doing what looked like a crossword puzzle. 2 younger women talking near the fireplace. And in the middle of all of it, standing at my kitchen counter pouring something into a glass, was my son Joel. He turned when he heard the door. The look on his face was not guilt. That's what stunned me more than anything. It wasn't guilt or surprise or the look of a man who knows he's been caught doing something wrong. It was irritation, like I was the one who'd shown up at the wrong time. "Dad," he said, "what are you doing here?" I looked around the room. The man in my recliner had turned to look at me. The children had stopped running. The woman at the table had taken off her reading glasses. "I'm sorry," I said, because I didn't know what else to say in that first moment. "Who are these people?" Joel set his glass down and walked toward me, and he lowered his voice in a way I didn't like. "These are Brenda's family. Her mom and dad, her sister and her husband, their kids. They drove in from Madison for the week. I was going to tell you." "When?" I asked. He didn't answer that. Brenda was my daughter-in-law. I'd met her at their wedding 3 years earlier, a quiet ceremony in Seattle that I'd driven up for alone. She was pleasant enough. I didn't know her well. We'd had maybe 4 conversations of any real substance in 3 years of her being married to my son. "Joel," I said, still quietly, "this is my house." "I know that, Dad. Did you ask me if you could bring 8 people here?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't think you'd be using it until Thanksgiving." "That's not what I asked." "The man in the recliner." Brenda's father, I'd figure out later, shifted in his seat. He had a big frame and a comfortable way of sitting in other people's things that told me he'd been comfortable in my recliner for more than just tonight. Brenda appeared at the top of the stairs then. She was holding a folded towel, which I understood to mean she'd been using my upstairs bathroom, my master bath, the one with the clawfoot tub Carol had picked out from a salvage yard in Astoria and refinished herself over a single long weekend 20 years ago. Brenda looked at me and then at Joel, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. "Mr. Calloway," she said carefully, coming down the stairs. "We didn't know you were coming." "Hugh," I said. "You can call me Hugh. We've been family for 3 years." The room had gone still. The children had retreated to the corner. Brenda's sister was pretending to look at her phone. "Dad," Joel said, and his voice had shifted now. There was something in it I recognized from when he was 17 and I'd caught him lying about where he'd spent the night. A kind of managed patience, like he was waiting for me to be reasonable. "Can we talk about this privately?" "We can talk about it right here," I said. "I'd like to know how long this has been going on." He looked at Brenda. She looked at the floor. "This is the second time," he said. "Second time this trip?" "Second trip." I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. Second trip. Meaning he'd brought a house full of strangers to my home, to Carol's home at least twice, without telling me, without asking, without so much as a text message. "The first time was in September," he said, like giving me the information voluntarily made it better. "Just for a long weekend. Brenda's parents had never seen the coast." "Did you clean up after yourself?" I asked, because I didn't know what else to say while my mind was still catching up to the situation. "Of course we did, Dad." I walked past him into the kitchen. There were dishes in my sink. Not soaking, not mid-wash, just left there. A pot on the stove with something dried and crusted at the bottom. Grocery bags on the counter. Things they'd bought, which I supposed I should have been glad for. But I wasn't thinking about groceries. I was thinking about a clawfoot tub and a woman who'd spent an entire weekend with her hands in paint stripper to make it beautiful. I walked back out to the living room. "I need everyone to give Joel and me a few minutes," I said. Brenda's mother put her crossword down. Brenda's father took his time getting out of my recliner. The children were ushered down the hall. It took about 5 minutes for everyone to find somewhere else to be, and then it was just Joel and me standing in my living room with the fire going that I hadn't lit. "I want you to explain this to me," I said. "I want to understand what you were thinking." "I was thinking you weren't using the house," he said. "I was thinking Brenda's family wanted to come to Oregon and hotel rates in Cannon Beach are ridiculous, and we have this place just sitting empty." "I have this place," I said. "I have this place, not we." He had the grace to look down at that. "You know what this house is to me," I said. "You know what it meant to your mother." "I know, Dad." "Do you?" "Because I'm looking around and I see a stranger's feet have been up on Carol's furniture, and someone's been sleeping in the room where she died, and I don't think you know what this house is at all." He went quiet. That was the first moment I saw anything resembling shame cross his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have asked." "You should have asked," I agreed. There was a long silence. Outside, the ocean was doing what it always does, indifferent and constant, and I was grateful for the sound of it. "So what do you want to do?" he said. And that was the moment I understood the full shape of it. He wasn't asking what I needed. He wasn't asking how he could make this right. He was asking what I was going to do about the situation he'd created, as if the outcome was still negotiable, as if I owed it to him to find a workable solution for the 8 people he'd installed in my house without my permission. I thought about what I wanted to say. I am not a man who raises his voice, never have been. Carol used to say that was my worst quality, that I went so quiet when I was angry that it was hard to know I was angry at all. She learned to read it. Joel never did. "How long were you planning to stay?" I asked. "We have the house through Sunday," he said. "You have the house through Sunday," I repeated. "You made a schedule for my house." "Dad." "It's Wednesday night," I said. "I want everyone out by Friday morning. That gives them tomorrow to see the town, and it gives me time to be reasonable about this." He started to say something. I held up one hand. "Friday morning, Joe. That's the compromise." He looked at me with that same mannish patience, and I realized he'd expected me to back down. He'd expected me to absorb this the way I'd absorbed so many things over the years, The unpaid loans, the missed calls, the absence at Thanksgiving 2 years ago because Brenda's family had plans. He'd expected me to find a way to make it okay for him. I went and got my overnight bag from the car and I slept in the second bedroom, the one with the twin bed I'd kept for when my daughter visits. I lay there and listened to the muffled voices downstairs, and I thought about Carol, who had a gift for knowing when something needed to be said and when it needed to be shown. I decided to show it. The next morning I was up before anyone. I made coffee in my own kitchen and I sat at my own table and I watched the light come up over the water, which is the whole reason we'd bought this house in 1993. Brenda's mother came down around 8 and seemed surprised to find me there. We had a polite, uncomfortable conversation about her drive from Madison. She seemed like a decent woman. None of this was her fault. Joel came down around 9. He poured himself coffee and sat across from me and he said, "Look, I've been thinking. Maybe we could work out some kind of schedule. Like, you tell me when you're planning to come down, and we make sure there's no overlap." I put my mug down. "A schedule," I said, "just so it works for everyone." "Joel," I said, "there is no schedule. This is my house. You need my permission to bring guests here. That's the only system." He looked at me the way adult children sometimes look at their parents when they think their parents are being rigid. There's a particular flavor of patience to it, like they're humoring someone who doesn't understand how the world works anymore. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," he said. "I know you're not," I said. "But you took something anyway. You took the assumption that this place is yours to use, and I'm telling you it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Brenda's parents drove 22 hours, he said. "I understand that," I said, "and I'm sorry their trip is being cut short. But that's a consequence of a decision you made without involving me. I can't fix that for you." He stood up. He put his mug in the sink on top of the dishes from last night. He said, "Fine," in the voice he uses when things are not fine, and he went back upstairs. By 10:30, things had gotten complicated. Brenda's father, his name was Ted Harmon, and he'd been perfectly cordial to me every time our paths crossed in the kitchen or the hallway, had apparently taken Joel aside and told him that this was awkward and that maybe they should just find a hotel after all, and that set off some kind of argument between Joel and Brenda that I could hear through the wall. I put on my coat and I walked down to the beach. Cannon Beach in October is not what the postcards show. It's gray and cold and the wind comes off the water with intent. I walked south along the waterline with my hands in my pockets, and I thought about what Carol would say. She had a clarity I never had. She would have known in 30 seconds whether Joel's behavior was a one-time lapse or the shape of something bigger. I thought about the money. That's the thing I hadn't let myself think about directly yet. Joel had borrowed $11,000 from me over the past 2 years. Not all at once, it came in pieces. 3,000 here, 2,000 there. Once 4,000 when he said he and Brenda were behind on rent. I'd given it without fuss because that's what you do. You help your kids. I hadn't asked for it back and he hadn't offered. I thought about the birthday card I'd sent in March that he hadn't acknowledged until I texted him 3 weeks later. I thought about how he'd called me in August, not to check on me, but because he needed me to co-sign something for a car lease. I'd said no. He'd said he understood. He hadn't called again until September, which, it turned out, was around the time of the first unauthorized trip to my house. I stood at the edge of the water, and I let it get my shoes wet, which Carol would have scolded me for, and I made a decision. When I got back to the house, Joel was in the living room alone. Brenda and her family were upstairs packing, I assumed. "Sit down," I said. He sat. "I need to tell you some things," I said, "and I need you to hear them without interrupting." He nodded. "I've done a lot for you over the years," I said. "I'm not saying that to hold it over you. I'm saying it because I think somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing it as something I chose to do and started seeing it as something I was supposed to do and started seeing it as something I was supposed to do. And that changed something in how you treat me." He started to say something. "I asked you not to interrupt," I said. He closed his mouth. The money I've lent you, and I use that word carefully because I've never once asked you to pay it back, totals $11,400. I'm not asking for it back today. But I am telling you that I will not lend you another dollar, not because I can't, but because I've noticed that money comes between us and it makes you think less of me, not more. And I don't want that. He was looking at the floor. This house, I said, is going into a legal document. I'm calling my attorney next week and I'm putting in writing that it cannot be used by anyone without my written consent. That protects both of us. It means there's no ambiguity. Dad, you don't need to do that. I think I do, I said. I think the fact that you brought 8 people here twice without asking me tells me that we have a different understanding of what's appropriate, and I'd rather be clear than have this conversation again in 6 months. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, I could hear Brenda talking to her mother. The children were running again. I didn't think it was a big deal, he said finally. I know you didn't, I said. That's what I'm telling you. Something shifted in his face then. Not quite the breakthrough I'd hoped for, but something. A loosening around the eyes. I've been stressed, he said. Work's been bad. Brenda and I. He stopped. It's been a hard year. I know, I said. You could have called me. I didn't want to dump it on you. Joel, I said. You dumped 8 people in my house. That was considerably more than a phone call. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. Brenda's family left Friday morning, as I'd asked. Ted Harmon shook my hand at the door and said, quietly, that he was sorry for the trouble. His wife hugged Brenda goodbye on the porch and told her to call when they got back to Madison. The children waved at me from the back seat like I was someone they'd just met, which I suppose I was. Joel and Brenda stayed one more night at my request. I made dinner, oven-roasted chicken, roasted potatoes, a salad from what was left in the refrigerator, and the 3 of us ate at the kitchen table for the first time in probably 2 years. Brenda was quiet, careful, working something out behind her eyes. At one point she said, I want you to know that I didn't know you weren't aware of what was happening. I nodded. I believed her, mostly. After dinner, Joel and I sat on the porch with decaf. Neither of us drinks much anymore, and watched the dark water. The stars were out. Cannon Beach gets real stars in October when the tourists are gone. I need to do better, he said, and he said it to the ocean, not to me, which was somehow more believable. Yes, I said, you do. I'm going to pay you back, he said. The money. I want to set up a payment plan. I looked at him for a moment. He meant it. I could tell from the set of his jaw the way he was staring straight ahead. He was 41 years old and he was sitting on his parents' porch telling me he was going to pay his debts. Okay, I said, let's figure out something that works. We talked for another hour. Not about the house, not about the money, not about Brenda's family or the 8 people or the dishes in the sink. We talked about when he was 12 and we drove to Crater Lake and the car broke down in Roseburg and we spent the night in a motel that had a pool. But the pool was empty and we swam in it anyway, just the 2 of us pretending. We talked about Carol. We talked about what she would have said. He cried once, briefly, and turned his face toward the water so I wouldn't see, but I saw. I put my hand on his shoulder and I left it there. They drove back to Seattle the next morning. I stood on the porch and watched until the car was out of sight, and then I went inside and I opened every window, the way I always do when I first arrive. Because Carol taught me that, said a house needs to breathe after it's been closed up, and I let the October air move through every room. I called my attorney that Monday as I'd said I would. The legal document was straightforward. A simple property use agreement, clear language, no room for interpretation. I also called my financial advisor, and I moved the beach house into a trust. It was something I'd been meaning to do for years. I had it done by the end of the month. Joel called me every Sunday after that. Not every Sunday at first. The first few weeks were spotty, like someone practicing an old instrument they'd nearly forgotten how to play. But by December it was consistent. He'd call Sunday evenings around 6 and we'd talk for 20 or 30 minutes, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about things that mattered. He made his first payment on the loan in November. $250, sent through Zelle with a note that said simply, "Working on it, Dad." I didn't need the money, but I needed him to send it. I went back to the beach house for Thanksgiving alone, which was what I'd planned all along. I cooked a small turkey and watched the game, and in the evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket across my lap and the glass of the good bourbon I keep for occasions, and I talked to Carol the way I always do when no one else is around. I told her about all of it, the 8 people in the living room, the dishes, the recliner, the almost laugh from Joel on the porch. I told her I thought we were going to be okay. The wind came off the water and moved through the house the way it always does, finding all the places where the windows don't quite seal, and I've never once gotten around to fixing them because Carol said she liked hearing it, and some things you leave exactly as they are. That was the hardest thing I ever did for my son. Not the conversation, not the legal document, not the boundary I finally held after 64 years of being the kind of man who folds. The hardest thing was deciding that loving him and letting him take advantage of me were not the same thing, and that the moment I stopped confusing the two was the moment we had a chance at something real. I keep coming back to the dishes in the sink. Not the 8 strangers in my living room. Not the man stretched out in my recliner. Not even Joel's face when he said, "I didn't think you'd be using it." I keep coming back to the pot on the stove with the dried, crusted bottom, because that's the detail that told me everything I needed to know about how things had gotten to this point. Someone had cooked in my kitchen, left the mess, and walked away without a second thought. That only happens when a person has stopped believing the mess belongs to them. That's what I'd done. Over years and years of absorbing things quietly, of lending money without terms, of saying it's fine when it wasn't. I had taught Joel that the mess was mine to carry. Not out of cruelty. He's not a cruel man. Out of a lesson I'd accidentally been teaching him since he was old enough to borrow $20 and not pay it back. The lesson was, Dad will handle it. Dad always handles it. Dad is the safety net, and safety nets don't have feelings. There's a cost to that kind of love. I don't mean the $11,000, though that's real enough. I mean the cost to him. Every time I stepped in before he had to figure something out on his own, I was telling him, quietly, without words, that I didn't believe he could. And a man who has never been trusted to handle his own consequences eventually stops believing he can. He starts looking for the next net. He starts measuring his relationships by what they'll absorb. What I did that October wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't punishing Joel. I was, maybe for the first time, respecting him enough to tell him the truth, that the way things had been going wasn't working for either of us, and that I expected more from him because I believed he was capable of more. That's not a small thing to say to your adult son. It takes something to hold that line when he's looking at you with that managed patience, when you know that the easier thing is to find a workable solution and let the moment pass. The courage to hold that line, that's something I had to build in myself the same way Joel is going to have to build it in himself. It doesn't come naturally to men like me who were raised to keep the peace. You have to decide, at some point, that the peace you've been keeping isn't actually peace, it's just postponement. What I saw on that porch in October, when Joel said he wanted to pay me back, that was the beginning of him using his own judgment, his own sense of what's right, without me engineering the outcome. That's the thing I'd been accidentally preventing for 20 years. When I finally stopped preventing it, he surprised me. I think about Carol when I think about all of this. She had a quality I've spent my whole life trying to understand, a kind of clear-eyed wisdom that never confused love with accommodation. She loved fiercely and she held her ground. I used to think those two things were in tension. Now I think they were the same thing, expressed differently depending on what the moment needed. I'm 64 years old. I live alone in Portland. On Sunday evenings at 6 o'clock, my son calls me. We talk for 20 or 30 minutes, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about things that matter. He made his second payment last month, sent it the same way with a short note. That's enough. That's more than enough. Some things you can't rush. You just have to do the right thing and let time do the rest.